Hi guys, I am recording this right now in Bloomington, but in the next week I will be in New York City for a conference. In an effort to make sure I'm still doing my part as a group member, I am going to record this part of my presentation. So I will apologize now for the hand-drawn pictures and especially the countries. They get worse as they go along, so bear with me. So for my part of the project, I focused on trade embargoes between the US and their allies and China during the Cold War, and also just the human rights aspect of using a trade embargo as a form of diplomacy. So the first source that I used was a chapter from a book by Rosemary Foote called The Practice of Power. It was published in 1997, and the chapter that I focused on is called Trading with the Enemy, and it focused on specifically how the US used a trade embargo to manipulate China and their relationship that they had, but also how all the other countries in the world responded to this embargo and either allied with the US or found fault in the fact that they were using food as leverage in China. Originally, the US had set up a arms embargo to stop China from having any impact in the Korean War and the Vietnam War. They also didn't want the spread of communism, so making sure that China didn't have any ammunition in that fight was definitely important to the US. But once they saw how powerful they were in taking away the ammunition, suddenly they decided that they could also manipulate China through the use of food. Rosemary Foote uses many sources to argue her point. Many of these are historical sources, meaning they come from the US State Department, such as this article entitled Foreign Relations of the US, and also not just the American sources, but the use of Chinese publications, such as On the People's Democratic Dictatorship, which was written by Mao Zedong during his time in power. She also uses many diplomatic sources, since this is a study of diplomacy between the US and China. She uses a journal article by Donald McLaughlin entitled Controlling the Waves, Dean Acheson and the US Foreign Policy in Asia. She also uses a publication by the US Congress by Robert L. Price entitled International Trade of Communist China from 1950 to 1965. So she's using both options of scholarly articles and also government work. In addition, she brings in many other voices, such as Michael B. Yehuda and his article written and published in London, Yasuhara, an author from Japan, and Heinrich Bechtold, a German writer who published an article entitled The Federal Republic of Germany and China, Problems of Trade and Diplomacy. Lastly, she also brings in an Australian voice to sort of even out the playing field. Her sampling of the data and her methods are very similar in terms of using quotes and specific studies in order to apply her assertion that even though this was a binary relationship, many actors had a part in the US and China embargo. She uses many similar articles to map out a chronological line between 1950 and 1970s. And she also uses many sources in order to broaden the argument and not keep it so country specific. Her sources are mostly secondary, although she does reference herself inside the book and to other work she's done in the past. The variables that she uses are mostly just country ideals. The butting heads of Mao and Truman, and eventually the calming that comes with Nixon's administration. Also, the interaction of these two countries and how they worked through the UN in order to impose the embargo and remove the embargo. The conceptual framework that Foote is using I would describe as descriptive categories. She's using all of these sources to analyze the past and explain how one phenomenon moved through different eras. She begins with marking out 1950 to 1958 as the fate of the embargo. Secondly, she marks out 58 to 71, This was the Chinese policy and consequences for trade. Lastly, she lines out the 1972 to 79 period. These were the trade patterns under the embargo, where the Chinese had become accustomed to how they were treated by the world, and also just a look forward into what the situation was in the 90s and later on into what we see the relations are today. For my second article, like I mentioned before, I wanted to look at how human rights fits into food embargoes. If your government or the larger government in the United Nations is applying a food embargo to your country, does it affect you, and should it affect you? So I looked into Smita Narula's article that she wrote in 2006 entitled The Right to Food, Holding Global Actors Accountable Under International Law. And so what she did was take a very statistical view at how hunger works and where it can be worked on. So she used statistics like 840 million people are malnourished in the world today. 95% of those people live in the developing world, and 150 million of them are children under the age of 5. These are all coming from the UNDP. She also uses stats like economic growth in East, South, and Southeast Asia was largely responsible for 158 million people not being malnourished from 1979 to 1992. She also uses quotes from people, so it wasn't just a quantitative study. She called in Amartya Sen and used a quote from her stating that in order to fight hunger, you have to focus on the entitlement. So she uses these broad statistics on hunger, but she also brings in all of these respectable voices and moves from this sort of rapid fire statistics to theory that she has formulated but is still backed by multiple experts. She only ever uses secondary sources and never quotes or cites herself. But her variables are hunger and the economy, and also the diplomatic response to an embargo being placed on yourself. She looks at hunger as a rights issue and sees the economy as a sort of shifting balance between putting people at risk of hunger and being successful. Something to think about.